Welcome, everyone. And I just want to acknowledge that Sport Calgary is located on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta. This includes the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, collectively known as the Blackfoot Confederacy. Yitchka Nakota, Wichitabi First Nations comprise of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney bands, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation within Alberta Districts 6 and 7. And I would just ask that each of you take a moment to reflect on the lands on which you live, work, and play. So I want to welcome you. And just before I turn it over to Melissa Holland with the City of Calgary, I just want to thank Melissa, and she'll introduce the rest of the team that has been behind this. But this was a real work of collaboration, and in partnership with the city and Sport Calgary, the Anti-Racism in Calgary Sport Project is really aiming to understand the prevalence of racism and the reporting of racism in Calgary sports scene. And I know for those of you who aren't in Calgary, I believe that would be a lot of the same results. And we don't want to just talk about the results that have come in, but the path forward as well. So it is grounded in collaboration, working with a lot of the sport groups. And I know that Melissa and the team will expand on this, but there were various, from the survey, there were various workshops that were held. And again, this is to go over a lot of the results, and the focus group findings can be found on calgary.ca/sport. But it's also about the path forward, because we really want to help sport organizations and the City of Calgary and Sport Calgary understand and dismantle systemic racism that does exist and the roots of the inequities and injustices in various programs and services. And the city is committed to this. So I want to thank Melissa, thank her team, and thank everybody who's been a part of it so far. And we look forward to talking about a path forward and how we can continue to not ignore this, but really face it and make sport safer, make it more accessible, and make it more inclusive. So Melissa, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you, Katrina, and your team at Sport Calgary for all the help you've had in this project and the work that you've done to this point. Because I think work like this you can't do in a silo, and we need to be doing it together. And so Sport Calgary is a great partner for the city, and it's been fantastic to work with them more. I'm Melissa Holland, as Katrina said. I manage the Sport for Life policy for the City of Calgary. And really, before we kick it off and you get to hear from our researchers and the projects that we've done and the results that have come from them, I wanted to give you a bit of a background as to why we did some of this work in general. One of the commitments of the Sport for Life policy is to design and deliver sport programs and initiatives that are equitable, accessible, inclusive, and that they remove the barriers to participation for people, everybody, to participate in sport in Calgary. And so in 2023, our anti-racism team within the City of Calgary released a strategic framework. And we were trying to figure out, is this work that we should be undertaking? Is it valuable for us to understand and support it better? And so we did a bit of a needs assessment, a bit of a scan of experiences, and we found that there was really not a lot of Calgary-specific information on this topic out there, and that Indigenous, Black, and diverse racialized individuals did speak of experiences of racism in sport. So we felt like we needed to learn more, and that's how we ended up doing this engagement project. And so really to what Katrina was saying, it's to understand the experiences and to really help create awareness to the state of racism before we can understand what actions we can start to support and that can be taken to combat it. Our engagement is split into two different sections, as Katrina was speaking about. The first one is our survey. And so you'll hear from our City of Calgary researcher on that project first. And that survey was shared online to any Calgarian who would like to participate in it. But we did try to target it to people who participate in sports specifically. And then we brought on Habitus Consulting Collective and Action Dignity to focus on implementing our focus groups that had Indigenous, Black, and diverse racialized individuals who were willing to share their stories on racism in sport so that we could have a bit more of a nuanced understanding. And so you'll hear from Habitus second, but they'll both introduce themselves directly after I finish speaking. Once the findings of our research projects are presented, then they're going to come back together and share what the recommendations for action are from both of those projects. So we'll hear the recommendations for actions at the very end. Really, the purpose of the engagement, understand the prevalence, the reporting, the types of racism experienced, and then what we can start to do to combat it. We will put the results, and they haven't quite hit the website yet, but they will hit there as of early next week to make sure that we have both of our report findings up there and then what our next steps are. We did do some media interviews during the survey phase of this project, and so it's possible we have some media requests. Part of why we did this webinar today is to give sport organizations an opportunity to learn what we had so that when it does become more public, it's not a big surprise what our findings were. So we wanted to give you a chance to engage in this work. A few things to note before we get started. We understand this is a sensitive topic, and we encourage you to take care of yourself as we start to discuss this work. Our engagement isn't representative of all Calgarians. Our survey, we did intentionally. We decided to extend our reach to those who participate in sport and those willing to share their experiences. So our research is more directional, and Jenny, our researcher, will talk about that. But it was intended to look more broadly at the sports sector instead of getting a full view of Calgarians. We wanted to understand the sports sector specifically. We're not here to debate whether racism exists in sport. We know racism exists in all different aspects of our communities, sport being an aspect of and a facet of our community engagement. And so from our research, you'll hear very shortly, we do hear that people have experienced racism. So we're here to discuss more of what that looked like. And then this project wasn't designed to pinpoint or compare individual sports. So really instead, it was aimed to have a wide range of experiences across Calgary's sports sector, identify areas of supports or resources that might be helpful. Therefore, we can't answer questions around what sports do better or worse at combating racism. Our idea was to understand the whole sports sector as a general whole. Lastly, if you have questions, if you want to write them in the chat, that'd be fantastic, or hold them to the very end, and then we'll make sure to have time to go through this. My colleague, Eric, will be monitoring the chat, and he can put any of the answers that are more simplistic in writing into the chat. Otherwise, he'll read them out at the end so we can get our presenters to answer them for you. And as you've seen come up on the screen, we are recording, just so your knowledge as we move forward. So thank you. And I will bring forward our presenters now. And if you can introduce yourself, Jenny, if you'd like to go first, and then we will move forward from there.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Melissa. So as Melissa was saying, my name is Jenny Kelly. I'm a research coordinator on the corporate research team here at the city. And what we do on my team is we support the various business units at the city of Calgary who are interested in conducting research with Calgarians. So this work can be very wide ranging. We do a couple of very large random representative samples in the spring and the fall, which are our seasonal surveys of Calgarians, which normally includes about 2,500 Calgarians on perceptions of satisfaction with city services, quality of life, and general experiences on life in Calgary, to also doing some of these more smaller research projects, which are very focused on specific topics, like this project here that I completed with Melissa. And then just a quick little background on me and my research experience. I have pretty extensive experience. I completed a Master of Arts program in the Department of Sociology at the University of Calgary in 2012, and have over 13 years of research experience from both academic and community-based research. Pass it over to Nadia.
Hi everyone, I'm Nadia Ansari from Habitus Consulting Collective. We're a Calgary-based organization. We are specializing in strategy, evaluation, and research. We are basically Calgary-based, but we do have a national footprint in Atlantic Canada as well as BC. We have extensive experience in the government, nonprofit, and educational sectors, essentially where we bring evidence into research. We are extremely privileged to have partnered with the city over the last 5-6 years over many equity and anti-racism projects like this one. We've worked previously with Melissa and her team as well on a couple of other equity-related projects on. Sorry, can you still hear me? I think I just got mute. So sorry. Awesome. I will not take a lot of your time. So personally, my background in academics is I too have a PhD in immigrant settlement. So I've had academic experience as well as working in healthcare and settlement agencies, as well as on equity serving groups. So for this particular project, I'm happy to share the results that we've been working on over the last few months with Melissa and her team. Happy to join you here today.
Thank you. Awesome. If we wanted to kick off into our survey results. So Jenny, take us off.
Perfect. So next slide there. Yeah, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because there's a lot of information on it. This is just pretty much generally the background, basic information about what we were doing with Melissa and her team and how we were able to reach out to participants, which Melissa has already spoken about. A couple of quick things that I will highlight. The survey was in field from about mid-November to mid-December last year. And before we went into field, we did a pretty rigorous survey development process where we did quite a few different aspects of literature review on work on anti-racism in sport to identify areas of inquiry because we realized how sensitive and respectful we needed to be in how we were wording and approaching these questions. Once we had developed that draft, we did send it out to the anti-racism team at the City of Calgary for their feedback as well, just to make sure that we were in alignment with terminology used at the city and to provide their feedback on some of the content as well. And additionally, we did also connect with Sport Calgary, who did do a review of this survey. So we feel like we got a pretty robust survey that we were able to put out into the field. And then we did do some statistical comparisons between racialized and non-racialized to see if there was any differences between those two populations. But as Melissa was mentioning, we do tend to like to look at these results a little bit more as directional in nature because it is not that random representative sample that that we have done in other work. And sometimes the sample size when we start to do those comparisons gets a little bit small. So we like to just put that kind of warning at the front saying that it could be very directional in nature what we're looking at. So if you could go to the next slide, Melissa. As you can see here, through the different recruitment methods that were used, so connecting with sports organizations, putting posters up in different facilities with QR codes for individuals to scan, and then advertising it on social media, we were able to get 241 Calgarians to complete the survey. And we did end up getting just around half of them who self-identified as racialized. So one of the things that we do like to note, the recruitment methods, as I said, were not random, and participants actually self-selected into this to complete the survey. So this can imply that there was actually an increased interest in the topic, which is part of why we do say that some of these results might be a little bit more directional in nature. Next slide. Again, very wordy slide. I'm not going to sit here and read everything off of the slide for you, but one of the things that we did in our consultations with the anti-racism team is we found out how does the city define and look at racism. And so we got these three definitions from the anti-racism team. So individual racism, institutional racism, and indirect racism. We have a series of questions in the survey, which I'm going to be talking about in a minute, around experiencing and witnessing racism. We actually included these definitions right before we asked those questions, just so we were able to ground the participants in how we were approaching and how we were understanding racism. So if you can go to the next slide, Melissa. So to start it off, we did ask participants if they've ever experienced, witnessed, or experienced and witnessed racism in sport. And you can notice here, there was about 23% who'd witnessed racism in sport, 14% who had said they'd openly experienced racism in sport, and about 10% who said they'd both witnessed and experienced. What I do find interesting on this slide is if we look at the columns for racialized and non-racialized, those are the percentage of respondents who answered those questions. And when we did start to do some of that more nuanced look between the different groups, we noticed that there was quite a few, that there was a higher proportion a significantly higher proportion of individuals who did self-identify as racialized, who indicated that they'd either experienced racism or witnessed and experienced racism. So that's one of those directional trends that we're noticing, is that there's obviously with this population the potential for experiencing racism more. Next slide. And then what we did was we kind of broke down those who identified experiencing racism and those who identified witnessing racism. And we asked them a closed-ended question of what types of racism have you experienced? And as you can see kind of at the top of the chart there, there's quite a few forms of those verbal types of racism. So verbal abuse, name calling, and racist jokes. Those were some of the most common ones that were identified by survey participants. On the next slide, we did ask, how often is this happening? And what we found when we asked this question is that about nearly 2/5 of the survey respondents indicated that it always or sometimes is occurring within the sport. And if we look at the next slide here, for those who have, similar to for those who had experienced racism, we did ask for those who had witnessed it, what were the most common types of racism that you had witnessed? Again, coming in kind of in those top three, just slightly different order was racial slurs, name calling, racist jokes, and verbal abuse. So those again were just like those top of mind, closed-ended questions of what people in survey respondents selected for each of those questions. Now, if we go to the next slide, we do notice that, again, we asked how often have you witnessed racism in sport? It's a little bit lower incidence that was reported for witnessing racism. So it was about 1/4 indicated that they had witnessed racism sometimes, always, or often in their sport. And then to wrap up this section, if you can just go to the next slide, we actually asked an open-ended question of the participants that if they were comfortable discussing their experiences with racism in sport, if they could describe the incident. This is where things get a little bit more interesting, and I know Nadia is going to go into quite a bit more detail when she speaks about it, so I'm just going to highlight a couple of the things that I found quite interesting when I was going through this question. We still do see a higher incidence of some of those more verbal forms of racism. So the racial slurs and the name calling. But when people start to get into that more granular detail of talking about their experience, that's when you start to see those more subtle forms of racism showing up. And we're seeing exclusion from play and a lack of feelings of support or welcomeness being mentioned more often in the descriptions than first just kind of came to mind with the closed-ended questions. So this is why we always find, and we normally recommend when we're working with the different business units at the city, that it's always good to, if you're doing to approach a research project from a mixed methods standpoint. One of the other things that we did end up asking is how racism had impacted their participation in sport. And answers did vary from participants stating that they didn't change their participation at all, or that some just kind of had this resigned acceptance to just having that this will occur, to actually some respondents indicating that they had left sport completely. They just switched or moved to a different league or team where they felt like there was more there was more inclusion or representation of their of themselves there. Now, one of the other things that we really wanted to focus on in this survey was looking at representation, because being able to see yourself in the places that you're at can also provide similar backgrounds and that give you that in that perspective that you're kind of fitting in. And so to gain this understanding, we did put some thought into how we wanted to explore representation in sport, and we identified some key roles within sport that we wanted to see if people saw themselves reflected in. And that was athletes, volunteers, coaches, officials, and administration. And as you can see, when we start looking at that column that says represented fully and somewhat, overall, the percentages don't look that bad. Like for example, within fellow athletes, 72% feel either fully or somewhat represented. But when we start to again look at those differences between the racialized and the non-racialized, what we notice is that there is actually a significantly lower number of racialized survey respondents who say that they feel represented in some of those more leadership roles as we've been describing them in sports. So in the coaching staff, in officials and referees, and in administration. So that was something that we found was interesting and wanted to highlight there. If we can go to the next slide. We did also follow this up with a question of how welcome you feel in sport. And this is the good news story, I think, of the survey, where overall 88% of survey respondents did indicate that they felt welcome in sports. And racialized, it was 86% who said they felt welcome in sport in comparison to non-racialized, which is 90%. So there's no statistically significant difference. It's a little bit lower, but it's not significantly lower. So while they might not necessarily feel represented, that does not preclude them from feeling welcome in sports. So we thought that was a nice thing to highlight in this presentation for you. If we can go to the next slide. After we asked about those pieces, we wanted to know if survey participants were aware of how to report an incident of racism. And so overall, 53%, so just over half, did say that they were aware of how to report an incident of racism. But what I find interesting on this slide is that when we did the comparison between the racialized and the non-racialized, we noticed that significantly more racialized actually didn't know how to report racism in sport. And so the individuals who are more likely to experience it are indicating that they might be less likely to know where or how to report that. And then if we go to the next slide, reporting incidents of racism. It's pretty low. 1/5 of survey respondents have reported an incident of racism in sport, or as you can see, 70% said no, that they hadn't reported an incident of racism. Of that 21%, we did follow up with them with a question afterwards that asked who was the most common individual that you would report an incident of racism to. And the most common individual that they were reported to would either be a coach or a sports administrator. If we can go to the next slide. We did also follow up with asking support from your sports organization. So if you had reported an incident of racism in the survey, we followed up with this question. 41% of survey respondents did indicate that they felt supported from their sports organization when they did report the incident of racism. But what I find of note here is that 27% who indicated they would prefer not to say. There could be, we did not follow up again for those who said prefer not to say, but there could be a variety of reasons why they selected that response. It could be from simple things like they reported it to a volunteer, so they didn't see the association between the sports organizations there, or they might have been slightly concerned about, will this have a negative impact on my perceptions within the sports team if I report this? We did not follow up on that, so we can't say for sure what type of reason why they answered prefer not to say, but it could provide some insights into potential additional research that could be done on this topic. Next slide. We asked also for those who did not report, so that about 70% who had not reported, we asked them the reason for not reporting an incident of racism. And the top response was unaware of how to report the incident of racism, or, and unfortunately, things like belief, nothing will change, or lack of trust. Those were some of the key reasons for not reporting an incident of racism. Next slide. Lastly, in the survey, we wanted to find out about awareness and effectiveness of anti-racism tactics that sports organizations have begun to implement. Roughly around 1/2 of survey respondents were aware that their sports organization has an anti-racism policy, and only about 2/5 were aware of anti-racism training and resources that were offered by the sports organization. Well, there were no differences between racialized and non-racialized survey respondents on awareness of anti-racism policies. More racialized survey respondents actually were likely to indicate that they were not aware of anti-racism policies than non-racialized survey respondents. So again, something of note. And then additionally, there were overall lower levels of awareness of diversified hiring practices and mentorship programs for coaches. Next slide. And then just started to look into some of those effectiveness of these anti-racism approaches that organizations have been taking. And only about half of survey respondents indicated that anti-racism policies and communication of anti-racism stances were effective. While there were no differences between racialized and non-racialized survey respondents on effectiveness tactics, those who identified as racialized were again more likely to indicate that anti-racism policies were not effective. So the effective column, we have a combined net of the negative aspect of it, and that's where we're finding the differences, not necessarily on them being effective. And next slide. So at the end of the survey, we asked an open-ended question of how would you like to see sports organizations address racism in sport? And a common theme that really came out from this question was the need to acknowledge and educate players, staff, and families about racism, about what the impacts of racism are, and how to identify and report it. In conjunction with this, there was also several instances of referencing reporting mechanisms were not easy to find. So some of them are buried on websites, or they're not sure who the individual is that they would contact to be able to provide this information. So those were just some of kind of like those broad, high level themes that we identified from this section. There's a little bit more detailed breakdown in the full report that you can have a look at once it's up and available for everyone to look at. But I will pass it over to Nadia to talk about the focus groups.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, Nadia, take it over.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Melissa. So I'll just preface it by saying, first of all, I would like to acknowledge our partners, Action Dignity, who had supported us with this phase of data collection and focus groups. Just to further what Melissa and Jenny have both said, the purpose of this particular phase was not to find out which sports or which organizations or which associations people were experiencing racism or other racist actions or discrimination. But the focus was to explore and learn from the experiences of youth's experiences of racism and discrimination in the sports environment. And by youth for this particular segment, I mean between the ages of 15 to 24. That was the focus of these focus groups. However, recognizing that youth do not experience or face these acts alone, the whole ecosystem of youth, their parents, guardians, coaches, and referees make up the whole ecosystem, which kind of surrounds the youth experiences. We not only included youth, diverse, racialized, Indigenous, and Black youth, but we also reached out to diverse, Indigenous, and Black parents, guardians, coaches, and referees. So that makes up our whole participant group. So the number that you see here of 64 youth, parent, coaches, and referees refers to this whole ecosystem. We reached out to these youth knowing that we are not collecting a representative sample of everyone in Calgary who experiences racism or discrimination in sport, but we wanted to reach out to people who wanted to share their experiences. So the experiences that are listed here that we're basing this report off of are experiences that youth have courageously come out to share with us. So I just wanted to preface before going into the meat of the report We methodologically, we did it through 8 focus groups. The focus was on Indigenous, Black, and diverse racialized audiences. There were no professional athletes or representatives. We wanted youth who were participating in varying level of competitiveness, from recreational sports to maybe participating in maybe like, national or sorry, not national, but provincial or interprovincial provincial events as well. If we could go to the next slide, please. So for this particular slide, here, what you see here is a word cloud. And what we essentially tried to do was, when we were talking to youth around their definition of sport, they did not resonate too well with the definition of sport, definition of racism as the city's definition or other academic definition. So to contextualize their experiences, we wanted to have them speak about their own experiences. So we asked them to define racism as they experience it. They're very real experiences of racism, discrimination. They're very real, but they're also very individual to youth. So essentially what you see here, this word cloud depicts the number of times someone said something. So for example, the words that are in larger fonts, lack of understanding, hate, name calling, racial slurs, are what came up again and again when youth were describing what racism meant to them. This doesn't necessarily relate to racism and discrimination within sport context, but this is speaking broadly to their understanding of what racism is, their understanding of what discrimination looks like. So different examples of what you see here. So sorry, it's the key themes that came out of these racism experiences was they experienced racism as interpersonal, as institutional, or as systemic. So by interpersonal racism, we mean behaviors that occur between individuals. Institutional racism is racism that is felt and experienced within different institutional settings, like relating to policy, relating to procedures. And then systemic racism is the kind of racism that extends beyond an individual, or that extends beyond an institution and kind of spans the whole system and is more pervasive, I would say, and more difficult to break into. So these are the 3 main categories that we'll be speaking to when youth spoke. For interpersonal racism, like they experienced racism between different individuals, and like they said, it could be explicit. There could be explicit experiences of racism. There could be implicit experiences of racism. Explicit experiences are those that can be easily observed, that are overt experiences. For example, verbal slurs, verbal abuse, bullying, discriminatory, obvious behaviors. But for implicit experiences, those experiences were described as experiences that are felt but cannot always be seen, or that are not always too obvious. For example, stereotyping, Black athletes are only good at basketball, or Asian athletes are only good at badminton. So those kind of not very obvious experiences, disrespect, bias in decision making, were described as other examples of implicit interpersonal racism. Could we move on? Speaking to interpersonal racism, one thing that really shone out was how racism is not directly race-based. So when they were talking about experiences of discrimination, many youth spoke to experiences of discrimination that extended beyond just race. So they would speak to experiences of discrimination based on race and culture, or race and religion, or race and gender. So they felt that these experiences, we can broadly couch them as racism experiences, but when they're felt in conjunction with other aspects of their identity, those experiences became more intense. Similarly, like we were talking earlier about the roots of systemic racism, even though this is interpersonal racism, where even interpersonal racism has intergenerational roots. For example, if someone does a racist act, it doesn't necessarily depict an act in the here and now. Or if a child says something, for example, as it's written here, a child repeats what they hear. So even interpersonal racism can be rooted in generational backgrounds, which comes out between racism between individuals, but has deep set roots. Moving on to the second type of racism that was shared by participants was institutional racism. And this is when organizations, both organizational groups or other recreational facilities may have policies and practices that unfairly disadvantage athletes from Indigenous, Black, or diverse racialized groups from participating or fully participating in sport. One of the issues that was raised was how between competitive and recreational sports, the level of racism increases, it becomes higher and more intense as sports become more competitive. A lot of youth reported that they experience increased racial microaggressions or subtle insults, dismissals, stereotyping, as the intensity and the competitiveness of the sport became higher. And this ultimately resulted in a lot of youth just dropping out. This institutional racism can be seen as both formal racism as well as informal racism. And by formal racism, it can be depicted through differences in lack of investment in resources. For example, facilities in one area of the city might be better funded, some lesser funding or lesser training or growth opportunities might be present for sports that are popular in newcomer or Indigenous youth. These were just some examples that participants shared. As informal institutional racism example, there were examples shared of cultural barriers like language maybe that impede access to sporting events or sporting resources. Sporting events scheduled in conflict with major cultural events was another example that was shared as an example of institutional racism. These are some other ways in which institutional racism comes across, and this concept of underrepresentation was already touched upon by Jenny as well. When youth do not see themselves in sporting officials or sporting management or sporting administration, that creates a sense of lack of trust between sporting organizations and athletes, because when people don't see others who look like them or share their experiences, it can normally send a message that these environments aren't necessarily for everyone. And whoever's more dominant, visible in these sporting environments is seen as persons who these environments are for, and the other persons, the youth that we talk to especially, feel excluded. If we could move on. The third type of racism that people talk to again was, this relates to larger system level concerns. Systemic racism is racism that exists in environments, like I said, higher than individuals or institutions. Because these are greater systems, racism in these circles can create environments that may perpetuate racism because these are larger systems. More effort needs to be targeted towards these systems to break the perpetuity and the cycle of continuity. A few ways in which this type of racism was discussed was poor financial supports and investment in sports. People talked about being placed in underfunded teams. They spoke of higher costs of sports. They spoke of inequitable access to facilities like transport facilities, transport access, the time it takes for someone to get to a particular facility because it would not be present in their own neighborhoods. And then people spoke to lack of access to tangible and intangible resources, like lack of access to training or networking opportunities for certain groups, for certain diverse racialized groups. If we could move to the next slide. How this impacts is through poor accountability, because systemic racism, and I will touch it in a bit more detail. Generally, youth and parents feel like they're forced to take the responsibility of addressing systemic racism because it's so ingrained and it's part of a whole system that you cannot address it by talking to a single person or talking to a few individuals. So they feel like they're forced to take the responsibility to address racism. And by not directly addressing, there were a few instances of shared by the youth, for example, by how not directly addressing incidents of racism. Racism is somehow just swept under the carpet. And if there's an instance, for example, a youth athlete would be asked by the coach to just, deal with it on the ground, on the field. show the other team by winning the games. So youth essentially felt that when racism instances were not treated as racism, that created a problem, because to address a problem, you need to recognize it first. And by just sweeping instances under the carpet was again perpetuating that systemic racism and continuing the cycle of discrimination. Underreporting was a big part of the dialogue, was a big part of the conversation, because instances are underreported. This came out in the survey as well. Why they're underreported was spoken to in a bit more detail. The processes of reporting are unclear. Participants did not feel like they knew where to go, how to report. And even if they knew where to go and how to report, the process was either found to be too cumbersome or time-taking. So ultimately, people would just not go out. They would not report. So even though instances are happening, they're not being reported. Then the issue of poor transparency. Youth shared that they don't know who to report, and then they also cannot see what happens to a complaint. So when you don't see what happens to your complaint, when you don't see any action taken, you stop complaining, you stop reporting, you just go on as if nothing happened, or you maybe even drop out. And then the issue of fear of retaliation, which leads to the impacts of racism, because a lot of times issues are underreported because of fear of retaliation. What would happen to me if I report? Would I be kicked out? Would I be dropped from the team? I can't speak against the star player. So you don't just report. And this leads to quite a few psychological safety impacts of racism. As you can see here, these are a lot of areas where people spoke of psychological insecurity and self-doubt, social exclusion. There was talk of a gradual loss of joy. We just stopped playing. There's no joy in playing. When we started sport, we were excited, but now because of racism, because of discrimination, we feel anxious, we feel anxiety. So all of these combined lead to an environment of fear, an environment of, essentially not wanting to play, people dropping out. I'm conscious of time, so I don't think I will move on much longer. We can speak to the recommendations. I think I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, let's move to Jenny to start with our recommendations. And so both Jenny and Nadia are going to speak very briefly about the recommendations they heard from participants in this.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for a great presentation there, Nadia, as well. So again, lots of words on the slide, so I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but some of the big things that really stood out to me when I was analyzing the data with the survey was things like feelings of representation and welcomeness. For the most part, were on par for racialized and non-racialized survey respondents, especially among athletes and volunteers. But as I'd said during the presentation, representation in specific leadership roles such as coaching, administration, and officials was significantly lower for racialized survey respondents. So when I started looking at this kind of in that broader scope of the data, I was like, okay, so there is a lack of, there's less feelings of representation in specific leadership roles, and there's a minority of survey respondents who indicated that they were aware of diversified hiring practices and mentorship programs. So this could be one of those areas that could be highlighted as a place to explore explore looking into from an inclusion and representation of diverse populations in sport. Awareness of how to report incidents of racism are low, and it's especially so for the racialized survey respondents who are more likely to experience racism in sport. So having clear and confidential criteria for reporting an incident of racism was something that was highlighted by survey respondents, and that it's communicated to everyone who is involved, from athletes to parents to coaches to administrators. This may be a way to help address some of those lower rates of awareness and on how to report. One of the things that really came through in some of the open-ended responses, and Nadia really spoke to it just previously, was demonstrating that you are taking those actions to address those racism. So if something comes up, then it's not just oh, okay, well, we'll talk to that person, and there's no communication of what's happened with the reporting of that incident. Kind of just make sure to close that loop. And then awareness and effectiveness of anti-racism policies, again, were low, especially amongst racialized survey respondents. So as I was saying previously, increasing the awareness, education, and training of anti-racism in sport and anti-racism policies may help to increase the number of individuals who are aware of the tactics that sports organizations are taking.
Amazing. Thank you, Jenny. And now, Nadia, if you want to finish us off on this.
Speaking to the three buckets that we spoke to earlier, so interpersonal, institutional, and systemic, these recommendations are kind of couched in these three areas as well. So one area that came up again and again was cultural sensitivity and reconciliation. So capacity building through education and training, because education and training can address that generational roots problem, can address the awareness problem, can address the problem of not only what to do, but just recognizing that there is racism and discrimination and just acknowledging that. So capacity building through education and training was a recommendation that was put forth by almost all groups of participants. As well as was the fact around representation and role models, having people you can actually look up to who look like you and who would understand what you've gone through, and who you can see has they've gone through and come out on the other side as well. So representation was a big piece here as well. For relationship building involving outside system actors was a big key area, because when we talk about systemic racism, all system actors need to be involved in action that is long lasting and sustainable. So relationship building was another key area that was focused on. If you could go to the next slide. Accountability, sustainability, and reporting. I will club all of them together and speak to them as one big, like the biggest bucket that came out of our conversations, because like Jenny said as well, accountability and transparency in reporting was one key area where majority of the participants felt that there was a lag, that there was a gap that needed to be filled. Not only for just reporting instances of racism, but to know the actions that were being taken to breach that lack of trust that was maybe happening between athletes and sport environment actors. And then closing the accessibility and economic barrier gap as well was another area which was highlighted by participants, where there was a need to implement program initiatives to reduce economic barriers to boost sport participation from marginalized groups, ensuring equitable access for all Calgarians, regardless of where they live, who they are. Back to you, Melissa.
Perfect. Thank you so much, both Jenny and Nadia, for your presentation. Right before we ask questions of you all, or if you have any questions for us, I wanted to just talk about what our next steps are, in case that was one of your questions. And so our next steps, as a general whole, we are working on developing a roadmap with Sport Calgary and other sport organizations as well. And so we are starting to do that process of coming together, taking these recommendations. What can we do? How can we better support sport organizations in order to combat racism as a system, as Nadia was talking about? And so we're coming up with a draft of our roadmap. Our next steps after that will be in June. We will be hosting an open house with our drafted roadmap, where we'd love sport organizations and anybody in the sport world to come out and provide their input and their comments to that, so that we can then take those and have a finalized result, so that we can start to have those actions. And of course, we'll put all of that information transparently on our website as well, so that the accountabilities are there. And so that's our next step towards doing this. And of course, like I said, we can't do this alone. So anybody who is interested in continuing on this work, we really encourage you to come out and participate in the open house. Or if you feel like you have other places where you'd like to participate, feel free to reach out to us to do that. And just a last mention is, in the off chance that that media inquiries come to us, to any sport organization, we're happy to work with you on messaging if that was to happen, as well as just an awareness that that's something that we might be doing as well if it's asked upon us. So thank you for being here today and for listening to this. And we're happy to take any questions that you might have at this point.
Hi, I guess I have a question. Susan Iman, I'm from Lethbridge Sport Council. Thank you very much for this. I was wondering if we would how we would see the results when we saw that the survey had come out. It's very important work. I was writing down a whole bunch of the recommendations that you shared with us, and a number of them we had been working on with some project funding, but we weren't able to continue and make it sustainable. So I look forward to your roadmap as well. But one of the things I'm curious with the people who are online, are there local sport organizations online, or are the people who have attended this at a different level, like sport councils or community organizations? Or because what we are finding is, although we also hear that our local sport organizations would really like the support that it looks like Calgary is moving forward with, they're so busy providing programming that the additional work that needs to be done when we offer workshops and training and panels, very few show up because they're busy on the field of play doing their programming. So yeah, just wondering your thoughts on that, and if you know kind of the makeup of who has attended today.
Yeah, I appreciate that, the comment in general, and then the question. I do recognize some of the names on the call today, and I do know that they come from local sport organizations, but that we do have a mix of people who are here who come from a variety of different areas, whether that's administration of sport organizations through the city or connections through that. And we also are very, very aware that sport organizations are sometimes tapped out in terms of the ability to action. They're so busy, the resources are limited. And so that's actually one of the main pieces of what we're looking at for our roadmap, is to be able to say, what do you need that will help take some of that off your plate? How can we either develop some of this and help you implement it so you don't have to use the brain space to do that or the time to do that? We also know that training is something that is often oversubscribed as it is. And so is that the route forward? Perhaps not for us at this moment. And so trying to develop that with organizations so that we have the buy-in for it, because everyone knows this is important to move forward, to have increased participation and people feeling like they can be there, but what are the realistic steps forward? And so that's, to your point, what we're going to try to work on now.
Right. So then just one follow-up comment. The Alberta Sport Leadership Association is currently hiring for an executive director, and part of the strategic plan there is all about this, like awareness, education. So it'd be great. I will certainly, when that individual is hired, put it out there publicly, but also let Katrina know, who can then connect with you. I think that would be a very important part of your network.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We're actually very excited for what they're about to come out with as well, because I know that they're looking at some reporting structures, which has been a gap right now. And so we're looking forward to being able to collaborate with them. And all this work is moving forward as it does. And so the system changes quite quickly. And we're looking forward to having a connection with them to have that reporting, which is a big gap right now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from anybody else?
Melissa, we had a question in the chat. It just said, can we send in possible questions at a later date to someone? Lots of great information, just still digesting how to appropriately apply for our organization.
Yeah, that's definitely something we can do. I'm going to put my email in the chat right now, and so people can feel free to email me, as well as if you have connections to Sandra from Sport Calgary, she is a great resource as well, who's worked very directly on this project. So whoever you're more comfortable reaching out to, you're very welcome to do so. Okay. Last call for any questions that anybody may have. We can give a copy of the presentation. We're actually going to do this recorded so that you could have all the comments from our researchers here. And so we're happy to send out the recorded copy of this if that's something you'd prefer. Okay. If there's no other comments on this, once again, thank you for being here today and participating and continuing to work on this. We know this is important work, but we can't do it alone. So thank you for your participation, and we're looking forward to continuing to engage you in this work. And in June, when we're going to send out through Sport Calgary on our open house, we would love to have any of you there at that point as well. And we'll stick on for a couple minutes if anybody wants to stay and chat about this, but have a lovely rest of your day. And once again, thank you for being here.